A reading from the first book of Samuel. In those days, Saul went down to the desert of Ziph with 3,000 picked men of Israel to search for David in the desert of Ziph. So David and Abishai went among Saul's soldiers by night and found Saul lying asleep within the barricade, with his spear thrust into the ground at his head, and Abner and his men sleeping around him. Abishai whispered to David, "God has delivered your enemy into your grasp this day. Let me nail him to the ground with one thrust of the spear. I will not need a second thrust." But David said to Abishai, "Do not harm him, for who can lay hands on the Lord's anointed and remain unpunished?" So David took the spear and the water jug from their place at Saul's head, and they got away without anyone's seeing or knowing or awakening. All remained asleep, because the Lord had put them into a deep slumber. Going across to an opposite slope, David stood on a remote hilltop at a great distance from Abner, son of Ner, and the troops. He said, "Here is the king's spear. Let an attendant come over to get it. The Lord will reward each man for his justice and faithfulness. Today, though the Lord delivered you into my grasp, I would not harm the Lord's anointed." The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
On December 27th, 1983, St. John Paul II made one of the most profound and moving gestures of his pontificate. He went to meet a man named Mehmet Ali Agca in prison. This is the man who attempted to assassinate St. John Paul II. This gesture set off a reaction of reverence, of amazement, even beyond the church. People around the world were in awe at this gesture. And it reminds us, I think we're similarly awestruck by David's gesture in the passage that we just read from the book of Samuel. We have Saul out with 3,000 picked men. You can read that as 3,000 of the very best warriors of Israel that Saul could muster. And he's out to kill David. David is fleeing for his life after serving faithfully under Saul in his court out on the battlefield, as we know in the story of David and Goliath, even helping to deliver Saul from the oppression of an evil spirit. And Saul is still jealous, and he attempts to kill David. He's out for him. He's been after him for a while. If we go back through the book of Samuel, we see a few instances of David's escape of Saul's anger, the way he's after him. And we meet David in our passage today at this fateful moment. Saul is asleep. He has carelessly put his spear into the ground right in front of his head. He's provided the weapon. David can have Abishai pick up the spear, thrust him through, and Abishai's eager for it. He's probably articulating the response that would be more common. Our first thought, maybe, it won't take a second thrust. It'll be easy. It's right here. He's been careless, and he's come into our grasp, and we're ready. And then David astoundingly says, "Do not harm him, for who can lay hands on the Lord's anointed and remain unpunished?" This gesture is a really concrete realization of the kind of mercy and forgiveness that we do like to talk about, that we are amazed at in figures like David, like in St. John Paul II. But when it comes to living out and practically doing, we struggle with more. And I thought to myself, in preparing for this, what would have been going through my head? I'm not confident that I would have thought, Saul is the Lord's anointed. I can't strike him. I think I would have been more inclined to seek vengeance. And in our lives, how often do we see, proverbially, our enemy asleep with the spear at his head, and we respond not so generously, not so compassionately? Think about the opportunities when a brother gives into a common foible, something that annoys us, their weakness. Do we respond? Do we pick up that spear? Or when a family member, maybe a sibling or a parent, a cousin, does something that really bothers us, and we have this perfect philosophical or theological robust response, and we're just ready to let it go and let him have it. Do we respond with waiting, with the mercy that David shows? Now, as we think about this, we're often approaching the question from a Christian framework. It's important to remember, too, that David, though he prefigures Jesus, doesn't have the kind of teachings about compassion and generosity that mark Christ's ministry. David's response, I think, as David would see it, was actually one that was simply of justice, that he recognized who Saul was, that the Lord's choosing of Saul had a real significance in how David was supposed to treat him. He was, to his own mind, full of justice in this moment. And then it becomes more powerful when we consider how David's witness here is preparing us for Christ. Because Jesus, when we crucified him on the cross, when we had gone to sleep, so to speak, we had stuck the spear in the ground, Jesus' response was, "Father, forgive them. They know not what they do." It was not one of vengeance. It was not an all-powerful retaliation or act of vengeance, as we could imagine, as we are often given to. Now, in the life of the church, we have seen time and again the saints live out the kind of mercy, the compassion, the forgiveness that Jesus taught us, that David begins to show us today. And it was manifest not only in the concrete gestures, but in many of the words and writings of St. John Paul II. So as we struggle to become more merciful and to treat others with this forgiveness, let us remember, as St. John Paul II said, that darkness can only be scattered by light, and that hatred can only be conquered by love.
Dear